You don't look like someone who belongs in a place like this. The voice startled Daniel as he bent to pick up the tools he dropped in the hallway. He straightened and turned toward the doorway, where a man stood silhouetted against the pale light filtering in from outside. Tall, confident, and annoyingly self-assured, the stranger didn't look like someone who belonged here either. "I live here," Daniel said, brushing dust off his jeans. "Guess that makes me exactly the kind of person who belongs." The man smiled, unshaken by the sharpness in Daniel's tone. He stepped inside, offering his hand. "Dr. Julian Crane. I just started covering the practice around here." Daniel hesitated a moment before shaking the offered hand. Julian's grip was firm, his palm warm. Almost too warm, like it could melt something Daniel wasn't ready to let go of. "Daniel Kerrigan," he said, "my father's the one who needs you, not me." Julian's gaze swept the room, taking in the faded wallpaper, the sagging beams, the faint smell of mildew clinging to the air. "This house must have some stories to tell," he said lightly. Daniel let out a dry laugh. "It's old. That's about it." The house had plenty of stories, but they weren't the kind he'd share with a stranger. It had been in the Kerrigan family for generations, weathered and tired, much like the people who lived in it now. Daniel's father spent most of his days confined to a bed, his body betraying him with age and illness. Mara, Daniel's wife, was rarely home, always chasing the next big opportunity in her growing career. And Daniel? He felt like he was just passing time, trapped in a house that creaked with memories of what once was. Julian stepped further inside, his presence somehow filling the space in a way that felt disarming. He carried himself with an ease that stood in stark contrast to the tight knot of tension Daniel felt in his own body. When Julian spoke, his tone was casual but deliberate. "How long has your father been unwell?" "Years," Daniel said shortly, not wanting to linger on the subject. Julian nodded, his eyes softening. "And you've been taking care of him?" "Someone has to," Daniel replied, shrugging. He didn't say more, unwilling to admit how isolating it had been or how much he resented the silence that filled the house when Mara was gone. He wasn't sure why her absence still stung. Maybe because it reminded him how much they had grown apart, how much the marriage had shifted from love to obligation. Julian seemed to sense the tension and didn't press further. He opened his bag and moved toward the adjoining room where Daniel's father rested. His voice was calm and soothing as he introduced himself to the old man, asking questions and listening carefully. From the hallway, Daniel watched, his arms crossed. There was something about Julian's manner that unnerved him. It wasn't just his professionalism. It was the way he seemed genuinely invested, as if he cared about more than just another patient on his list. When Julian finished his examination, he stepped back into the hallway, rolling up his sleeves. "Your father's doing better than I expected, considering everything. He's tougher than most people I meet." "Yeah, well, stubbornness runs in the family," Daniel said, his attempt at humor falling flat. Julian leaned against the wall, studying Daniel for a moment. "And how about you? Are you holding up okay?" The question caught Daniel off guard. He glanced away, unsure how to answer. "I'm fine," he said quickly. Julian tilted his head, as if he didn't entirely believe him, but he didn't push. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm around." Daniel's throat tightened at the offer. He wasn't used to anyone noticing his struggles, much less acknowledging them. "Thanks," he muttered, though the word felt awkward on his tongue. That night, as Daniel lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, he found himself thinking about Julian's steady gaze, the way his voice seemed to linger in the air even after he was gone. He told himself it didn't mean anything, that he was just tired and overthinking. But something had shifted, a tiny crack in the walls he'd spent years building around himself. In his car, parked outside the Kerrigan house, Julian sat for a moment longer than he should have. He stared at the faint light, glowing from an upstairs window, and felt an unfamiliar pull. He told himself it was just the exhaustion of a long day, but deep down he knew better. Both men went to bed unsettled that night, unable to shake the feeling that something had begun, though neither dared to name it. "I see you're not much of a talker," Julian said, setting his coffee cup down on the old kitchen table. "But I don't mind doing the heavy lifting in a conversation." Daniel smirked faintly, leaning against the counter. "I didn't invite you to stay for coffee. You just made it yourself." "Occupational hazard," Julian replied with a shrug. Doctors are used to taking initiative. It had been weeks since Julian first walked into the Kerrigan home, but he seemed to have carved out a space for himself there, whether Daniel liked it or not. The visits had become more frequent, and though they were ostensibly for Daniel's father, the time Julian spent lingering after each checkup told a different story. He asked questions, listened attentively, and left traces of himself everywhere. The smell of his cologne hanging in the air, the warmth of his voice echoing in the quiet house, the small shifts in Daniel's mood that Mara never noticed when she returned home for brief, transactional visits. This time, it was a rainy evening. Mara had called earlier to let Daniel know she'd be delayed again, though she didn't offer specifics. Daniel didn't ask for any. Instead, he found himself sitting across from Julian, a reluctant host to a guest who made himself far too comfortable. "You know, for someone who's always here, you don't say much about yourself," Daniel said, breaking the silence. His tone was teasing, but the question carried a weight he couldn't entirely hide. Julian smiled, his lips curling into something that felt both inviting and dangerous. "What do you want to know?" Daniel shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "Where you're from, why you decided to be a doctor." "Normal stuff." Julian leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel as though weighing how much to reveal. "I grew up in the city, busy family, lots of noise, but I wanted something quieter. Something real." He paused, his gaze settling on Daniel. "I guess I like being needed." Daniel's stomach tightened at the way Julian's voice softened on that last word. He looked down at the table, tracing the grooves in the wood with his finger. "Well, you came to the right place. This house is nothing but quiet. And you?" Julian asked, leaning forward slightly. "What keeps you here?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no answer came. What could he say? That he stayed out of duty? That this house was the last thing tethering him to a life he wasn't even sure he wanted anymore? Instead, he deflected. "Someone has to take care of my father." Julian didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. His eyes lingered on Daniel for a beat too long before he stood and walked to the window. The rain was coming down harder now, streaking the glass and obscuring the view of the dying oak trees outside. "Looks like I'm stuck here for a while," Julian said, his tone light but his gaze heavy as he turned back to face Daniel. Daniel felt his breath catch, though he wasn't sure why. "Guess so," he muttered, his voice quieter than he intended. The storm outside seemed to seep into the room, filling the space with an electric tension neither of them addressed. Julian took a step closer, and Daniel felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The air between them was heavy, charged, as though the house itself was holding its breath. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Julian asked, his voice low. Daniel frowned, unsure if the question was about the house, the marriage, or something else entirely. "Sometimes," he admitted. Julian nodded, his expression unreadable. Then, as if testing the weight of his next words, he said, "Sometimes leaving isn't about where you're going. It's about who you're going with." Daniel's pulse quickened, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. The truth in Julian's words felt like a confession he wasn't ready to make. Julian stepped even closer, his proximity both unsettling and intoxicating. "You know," he murmured, "I don't think you're as fine as you keep pretending to be." Daniel's jaw tightened, and he forced himself to meet Julian's gaze. And what would you know about it? I see you, Julian replied, his voice steady, unwavering. More than you realize. The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Julian didn't move, didn't touch him, but the unspoken promise in his eyes was enough to set Daniel's entire body alight. For a moment, they stood there, inches apart, the sound of the rain pounding against the windows the only thing grounding them. Then Julian stepped back, breaking the spell. I should go, he said, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. Daniel didn't stop him, but as Julian walked toward the door, his absence felt like a physical ache. Daniel stood there long after the door closed, staring at the rain-slicked floor where Julian had just stood, his mind racing with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Tell me to leave, and I will. Julian's voice was low, steady, and stripped of all pretense. He stood in the dimly lit kitchen, his hands resting on the back of one of the chairs, his eyes fixed on Daniel. The storm outside had passed, but the air inside the Kerrigan house still felt thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were witnesses to what was about to happen. Daniel leaned against the counter, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as if to shield himself from the weight of the moment. He should say it. Tell Julian to leave, to walk out the door and never come back. But the words wouldn't form. Julian, this, Daniel started, his voice wavering. Julian stepped closer, his movements deliberate but not threatening. I know, he said softly, cutting him off. I know how complicated this is. But don't stand there and tell me you don't feel it too. Daniel's pulse was pounding so loudly in his ears he could barely think. This isn't right, he muttered, more to himself than to Julian. Maybe not, Julian admitted, his gaze unwavering. But sometimes what's wrong feels more honest than what's right. Daniel exhaled sharply, gripping the counter as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He thought of Mara, her absence, the chasm between them that had only grown wider over the years. He thought of the countless nights he'd spent alone, questioning every decision that had led him to this life. And now, here was Julian, standing in front of him, offering something he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Why me? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Julian smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried equal parts understanding and pain. Because you're real, he said. Because you've been holding everything together for so long that you've forgotten how to let yourself feel anything at all. And he paused, taking another step forward. I see you, Daniel. All of you. Daniel's throat tightened and he turned away, unable to face the intensity of Julian's words. But when Julian's hand gently touched his arm, it was as though a dam inside him had broken. He didn't pull away. Tell me to leave, Julian said again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. Daniel turned back to face him, and in that moment, every argument, every reason to say no dissolved under the weight of what they both knew to be true. Without thinking, without rationalizing, he closed the distance between them. The kiss was hesitant at first, as if both men were testing the boundaries of something fragile and forbidden. But it didn't take long for the hesitation to give way to urgency. Daniel's hands found Julian's shoulders, pulling him closer, and Julian responded in kind, his touch firm and grounding. For the first time in years, Daniel felt alive. Every nerve in his body seemed to awaken, sparking to life under Julian's touch. The shame and guilt that had been lurking at the edges of his mind melted away, replaced by a hunger he hadn't realized he was capable of feeling. But as quickly as it began, reality came crashing back. Daniel pulled away, his breathing ragged. I can't, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Julian stepped back, giving him space, but his expression was calm, understanding. I'm not asking you to make a decision right now, he said gently. I'm not even asking you for anything at all. But don't pretend this didn't happen. Don't pretend it didn't mean something. Daniel pressed his hands to his face, trying to steady himself. He wanted to deny it, to push Julian away and retreat back into the safety of the life he knew. But the truth was undeniable. "It's not just me," Daniel said finally, his voice trembling. "Mara, my father, this house, there's too much at stake." Julian nodded, his expression softening. "I know," he said quietly. "But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that life doesn't wait for you to figure it out. You can spend your whole life doing what's expected of you and still end up empty. Or you can take a risk and see where it leads." Daniel stared at him, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He didn't know what came next, didn't know if he had the courage to step into the unknown. But as Julian turned and walked toward the door, Daniel felt something shift within him, a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Julian paused at the doorway, glancing back one last time. "I'll see you around, Daniel," he said, his voice steady but laced with an unspoken promise. When the door closed behind him, the house felt quieter than it had in years. Daniel stood in the kitchen, the faint taste of Julian still lingering on his lips, and wondered if he'd just crossed a line he could never come back from, or if he'd finally found the courage to begin again.